Yesterday, American President Donald Trump said that he was going to send 2 U.S. nuclear-powered submarines somewhere around the Russian coastline, quote, just in case, he said, Russia does anything provocative. Now, this was all the latest in a series of moves and verbal statements on social media platforms, Truth Social and on X, between Medvedev, the former president of Russia, and Trump, and even Lindsey Graham was also getting into some of the mix here. And now then today we have additional information from what Russia's reactions are going to be to all of this. Just real quick, in case anybody may have missed it or if you didn't get all the information, this is going back several days before all of this happened. Medvedev was responding to some of the Trump's claim that he's going to put some new sanctions, and he has what at the time was a 10-day deadline on Russia to compel compliance with what Trump wanted, which is an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, which, of course, the Russians have always said is not even on the table, wouldn't even be discussed. So deadline or no deadline doesn't make any difference to them. They're going to continue on with their operations on the ground in Ukraine. Trump, on the other hand, still seems to think it's going to make a difference. He says, well, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but apparently he wants to find out. Well, Medvedev started this series of tweets where he says, hey, look, number one, we're not Iran, and we don't respond to these kinds of threats. Nobody tells us what to do with the deadline. We're going to do basically what's in our national interest. Trump continues to say things back. He had some harsh comments himself to Medvedev. So did Lindsey Graham. And then Medvedev sends out a new one where he says, listen, these ultimatums, every one of these new ultimatums is a step towards war, to which then Trump again responded with this now infamous statement here that he's moving these brains around. One of the things he's cited and that apparently motivated him was when Dmitry Medvedev said in terms of whether the U.S. would bring sanctions on both Russia and then China and India, secondary sanctions. He warned Trump to remember about the dead hand. Now, that has been claimed in a lot of Western media as a threat of nuclear war by the Russian Federation against the United States. Hence Trump's comment, if these threats turn real, just in case, I want to have nuclear submarines over there. Well, the dead hand is a Russian term for their reaction to a nuclear attack, i.e., if any opponent to Russia thinks that they can launch a nuclear strike and take out the leadership, for example, and then there's nobody to give an order to have a retaliatory strike, they have this system, it's called dead hand, that will allow the system to automatically generate a response should they be hit. So it's a statement that says, if you attack me with nuclear weapons, we have a system that will respond so you can't take us out. It was not a threat, not even a claim that we're going to attack you first with nuclear weapons. So that should have put the thing to rest right there. It's kind of embarrassing, if I'm just being perfectly frank, both of Medvedev and of Lindsey Graham and of the President Trump, that they're having all of this nonsense going back and forth on social media. It doesn't do anything positive. And in fact, now we see, especially with someone like President Trump, who's very thin-skinned, we've got to be honest with it, folks. I know a lot of you like him, but he's pretty thin-skinned, that he can't let something that from the deputy chairman of the National Security Council, who has no directive authority. He's the former president. He's not the president. Only President Putin has the trigger on that. He's the only one that can call it, just like Trump is the only one that can call it for our country. So if you have an issue, go to President Putin. But just like Lindsey Graham can say whatever he wants, he doesn't have any power. He has influence over Trump. He talks to him, but he doesn't have any power over that. So none of this needed to have happened. But now here we are. And so people are starting to pay a lot more attention to this. And in the immediate aftermath of this, we had, or actually not even the aftermath, this was on the same day. So it's not clear that this was actually a response to it, but it is what the Russians are saying right now, which is that hypersonic missiles, Orsnik, have now entered production and service. So you may recall some number of months ago that the Russians fired some Orsnik missiles, which were caught on camera. And there's literally no stopping them. There's no defenses against them that we have. Not the THAAD, not the Iron Dome system, Patriot systems. None of that stuff can defeat the Orsnik missile. And because they are super, I think they're more than hypersonic. I forget the exact speed that they fly, but it's extremely fast. And the kinetic energy alone, even if they just had an inert warhead, is enough to burrow quite a distance under the ground and can cause catastrophic explosive impacts just because of the heat and the power it generates upon impact. So they can cause severe damage. It's kind of like a Russian version of a bunker buster, but with a lot more power just because of the speed and all that, the kinetic energy. Russia has now said that they're into serial production. Some have said that this is actually a sort of a semi-tactical nuclear weapon capable in terms of its destructive power that can fall below the threshold of actually engaging in nuclear war, which gives the Russians, at least at the moment, an advantage that they have an additional tool to go to short of a nuclear conflict, but one that you can't defend against. And so Russia is just kind of putting everybody on notice that if anybody has any sense about escalating into a war, we have some missiles from which you can't hide and which you can't defend yourself. Again, this is a defensive statement. It doesn't appear to be an offensive. Obviously, a missile can be used in either offensive or defensive, but Russia is, by all accounts and by all evidence, wanting to use these only if they are attacked. And they're saying, don't get crazy and think you can come at us and have it be scot-free. We're not Iran. I think that's the intent there, is that Iran attacked the United States attacked Iran, devastated their nuclear program, and they only had a performative shot back against the United States that they knew would be shot down. They signaled ahead of time because they didn't want to escalate, because they can't get into a toe-to-toe fight with the United States. So they calculated that their interests lie in not getting into a war. Russia is saying, we're not Iran. We do have the capacity to hit back in ways you can't defend against. Don't start. That seems to be the primary message. But there are others in Russia that are worried maybe it's more than that, because they're concerned about whether they can trust the United States. And in fact, in this morning in the Russian media, there was this article, which, by the way, this is all translated by Google Translate. It's originally in the Russian language. The headline is the collective West ready for a small nuclear war with Russia? And in the article, the author writes, the further it goes, the more obvious the fact becomes that the collective West is really ready to fight against Russia itself when Ukraine finally fizzles out. But why aren't they too afraid that this will lead to a nuclear winter? According to Hans Christian, director of the Nuclear Information Project of the Federation of American Scientists, evidence indicates the return of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to the territory of the United Kingdom. Thus, the threshold for the actual use of nuclear weapons has dropped to the most dangerous line. The only question is, where will the new Hiroshima and Nagasaki happen then? This article also goes on to lament something that probably hardly anybody in the West even remembers. And back during the Biden administration, then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper released a kind of a nuclear doctrine where they talked about the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons to prevent strategic nuclear weapons from being used in certain circumstances. Now, whether this means anything for the current administration or not, this is stuff that the Russians are taking a look at, and they're concerned about it, that that we could have our own version of what's called escalate to de-escalate, that we may say we're going to use tactical nuclear weapons to show that we're serious so that nobody uses theater nuclear weapons. That is apparently one of the doctrines that Vladimir Putin has in his pocket, whereas the escalate to de-escalate. Now, when you have two nuclear powers that both have a version of escalate to de-escalate, then you obviously have the problem that if anyone uses a nuclear weapon, then the other side is going to have to be the adult in the room, and to not escalate things further, not to meet nuclear for nuclear, but just, okay, let's just have sane heads here and let's don't get into strategic nuclear forces, because once we get to that, it's game over for everybody. Life as we know it will cease to exist. Whatever survives from one of these mutually assured destruction where missiles are flying back and forth, the planet will likely never recover, at least in anyone's lifetimes that's alive right now, whoever happens to survive. So The thought being, let's don't get there. Well, the problem is with that requires, if anyone, whether Russia or the United States, uses a tactical nuclear weapon first, in the thought that's going to deter the other side, you have people that are afraid on the other side. And the hope that they get the right message and do the right thing, so-called, is a gamble. It's just like, it's like one of those roulette wheels, and you're putting all of your money on one number, and you have no idea where that marble is going to land. You just hope it's good, but you see that the much more higher probability that it goes bad than it goes good. Don't find out. Do not go there. If the United States uses a nuclear weapon first, it's gonna, the world will never be the same afterward. If Russia does the same thing first, nobody is going to win from this, folks. Nobody. So both sides need to back down and stop talking so much about all this nuclear weapons. And because the problem is that when you're the mental threshold, to the point that article made, I think it's accurate, and this applies to both sides equally. When your mental threshold continues to come down from which you're going to use, might use a nuclear weapon, then that does make it easier. So then now that when something happens outside, your willingness to use it, it's down this far instead of it's this far instead of this far, or up here, which should be way over here. It should only be considered if it's an absolute existential threat that it's either use this or we're all going to die kind of situation. That's what nuclear weapons are supposed to have been for ever since they were first used in 1945. Is that all the nations that have whatever it is, I think 7 or 8 right now, official nuclear powers. The idea is that you only use them for an existential threat, and that's why there's been a lot less interstate conflict between the major powers, because they both know that their nuclear weapons exist, so that they are deterring themselves from having that kind of conflict. Well, we're obviously with this proxy war where we're using Ukraine as the cudgel against Russia, and all of NATO is helping Ukraine fight against Russia without having their own troops. We're just right up to the edge of it anyway. And the concern is that if we keep talking this way, we keep moving weapons around here. Russia's done the same thing too, by the way. Several times throughout this war, I think I've shown some even on the channel here, where Russia will move some of its mobile nuclear weapons launchers around, and they'll video that. So that this is going on both sides. It's unhealthy, it's unhelpful, and it could be catastrophic. This all needs to stop, because this is if the one time that anybody uses a nuclear weapon, that genie's out of the bottle. This is not like 1945 where we had the exclusive use of it. Now there's a bunch of different players here, and God only knows what would happen if anyone uses it, especially against another nuclear power. Okay, that's not the only thing going on. That's not even the only thing going on here in the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine itself, and we've been talking to you a lot about the Pokrovsk and the Konstantinivka areas. Well, the Wall Street Journal has a piece out right now that says, inside Ukraine's effort to fortify hundreds of miles of defensive lines. The article notes the Ukraine is now hoping that installing a triple row of fortifications will prevent similar breakthroughs to the east, where Russia is pushing to capture the key cities of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. But gaps in the entrenchments have prompted some soldiers to warn that a patchy defensive belt could end up like the Maginot Line, the ambitious French fortifications that were bypassed by the Germans in World War II. So what this is telling you is that the Ukraine side is having lots of trouble continuing to build fortifications. I've shown you on the map several times here just recently how Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, which are basically the hinges upon which the entire Eastern Front pivots, are both in semi-cauldrons already, and it won't be much longer. In fact, the Russians are going further into the city of Pokrovsk itself. They're coming in the north. They're moving to cut it off further up into Rodinska, etc. And in Konstantinivka, likewise, with the capture of Chasiv Yar fully yesterday. Now then, it's an easier path for Russia to continue to try and cut that off. If either of those two gets cut off, then, of course, that opens the path for Russia to continue to move more. So what the Ukrainian side is doing is recognizing that risk, and so they're trying to build additional fortifications, and they're trying to build more of those triple lines of trenches and dragon's teeth and all kinds of stuff. Problem is, They don't have enough manpower to take care of all that. And they don't have enough resources either to be able to fight the war and build defensive trenches in the past. And as they said there, the Maginot Line, if you're not familiar with that, that's from World War II, where the French had built this elaborate, hundreds of miles long of various fortifications, trench lines, pillboxes, etc., that would have supposed to be preventing the Germans from invading France. Well, what they ended up doing was they went into an area where it was not quite finished. It wasn't quite as thick as the other places, where in terrain where the French didn't think they would be able to break through, and the Germans, of course, did. And then once they penetrated that line, which is something I've been talking to you about for months now of my concern, because once the Germans broke through that, they got into the rear of the area where now then the French didn't have any more fortifications because they thought that line was going to stop them. And once the Germans got behind them, then now the entire front line rolled up, the entire British and French defending armies in France. And that's one of my concerns that I've had here, is that if Russia breaks through some of these places, that could be the concern. Well, obviously, that's the concern on the Ukraine side as well. And now you see even the Wall Street Journal is putting some coverage to it, that is a growing problem. And here's the issue that you need to understand: the dynamics that are causing this patchy work, as they call it, and they're concerned, are only going to get worse. There's nothing on the horizon that can flip this around. There's just no more money to come that's going to come from the West, and not in the scale that would be necessary to try to solve that. But even if the money were to somehow be manufactured, Ukraine doesn't have the manpower, because consider they have to be able to have manpower behind the front lines building these fortifications. And of course, Russia is aware of this, so they're trying to use long-range fires to interdict that in any case. But they also have to have people on the front line. Well, Russia is penetrating in several places. The Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk I mentioned there, also in Kupiansk. They are in some of the outskirts of that city in the northern part of the Eastern Front, and then down in the Kherson area, on top of what's already continuing to get kind of the pace of operations in the Sumy and the Kharkiv areas as well. So Ukraine can't just move a bunch of forces off of there, because then the Russians will accelerate their operations there. So it truly is a finger in the dike situation. All of these numbers and all this dynamic will continue to get worse and worse for the Ukraine side. So we keep coming to the same conclusion. The best interest of the Ukrainian side, the best interest of the Western alliance, the best interest of the United States is to get this war over with on the best terms available. Vladimir Putin still says, just to this day, I think yesterday he quoted again, he's still willing to talk. They're still willing to have negotiations, but they are unchanged on their terms. President Putin met with Lukashenko a day before yesterday, I think it was, and reiterated that. The door is still open for negotiations, but every time you bypass that door, the next time it comes up, the conditions get worse. They always have done that, and there's every reason to think that's going to continue to happen. Also related in terms of the war over there is this deadline that I mentioned that's coming up on August 8th. And central in that, which was referred to by Dmitry Medvedev in his tirade back against Trump, is the tariffs on China and India. And maybe India is the bigger piece here, because India is not aligned with Russia, but they're not aligned with us either. They are just doing business with everyone. They're trying to say, hey, we want to have good relations with the United States, but we also have good relations we want good relations with China. We want good relations with Russia. So they're kind of not aligning themselves with any major power, but they themselves are a rising power. So they're going to play it even, so as they say. Well, you have the likes of Lindsey Graham, who wants to put them in a choose whether you want to or not. You're either with me or you're against me, which is not a good idea. And so now that here we're coming up on August 8th is going to be when that deadline. And then the question is going to be, are we going to put these tariffs on India? Well, according to the New York Times this morning, India will buy Russian oil despite Trump's tariffs, officials say. Indian officials said on Saturday that they would keep purchasing cheap oil from Russia despite a threat of penalties from President Trump, the latest twist in an issue that New Delhi thought it had settled. So this is not a good situation, folks. There's no good place here. Again, the war is lost. Get that through your head. Everybody in the West needs to get this through your head. The war is already concluded, and in terms of the outcome, we know it. Russia won. the Ukraine side lost, and all of our support. We weren't able to stop it. It's just too late already. The conditions and the fundamentals that go into war making are irrevocably on the Russian side. You can't reverse it in our lifetimes. It's going to take a generation after the war is over before you can even talk about something else, almost like the distance between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. Not that we're looking for anything like that, but the point being that you had a quarter of a century before anybody was ready to go back to war again. Same situation would be the case here. You can't just end World War I and then start another war, a year later. It just doesn't work that way. And in the midst of the fighting, you certainly cannot reverse the catastrophic losses the Ukraine side has suffered, both in territory, personnel killed, personnel wounded, and personnel have fled the country, millions of them. So the war is over. So why do you want to take a chance now by playing an economic card that would harm one of our, not allies, but somebody who could be our friend in the international relations, somebody who could, with some deft foreign policy, be able to maybe influence some of our adversaries, either Russia or China? I mean, if you're just thinking, what's good for us, it's going down that path right there. The last thing we should do is to make an entity like India, a country like India, that could be, if we're, it's a win-win situation where we're saying, hey, we can mutually benefit from something. Why don't you help us out with some of these difficulties here where we have less influence with the Russia or China? That's what we should be doing. But instead, we're literally putting them in a position, if we follow through with this on the 8th of August, to put them in a position where it's like, hey, choose us or them. And they may say, okay, if you're going to force me, I'm choosing them, because I think that's where my future lies. You are hoping, again, almost like this roulette table, that the pressure and the trying to compel somebody's actions against their national interest for our national interest is going to work. I think it's pretty unlikely that's going to work, and that is going to worsen the situation. And why would you take the risk of something like that when it wouldn't matter anyway? If you succeeded, if you got India to stop buying Russian oil, that's not going to end the war. That's not going to cause Russia to agree to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. That will never happen unless there's some other dramatic change on the battlefield, but not because of finances. Russia will find a way around that, like they always have. They will make sacrifices. They will make cuts. They will do whatever they need to do. They have the natural resources on their own to continue fighting no matter what. So it is beyond foolish to even think about having this rupture in American-Indian relations, which could only harm our own economy and our own international standing. Just don't do it. Okay, let's go to the Middle East. There's been developments up there as well. We've been talking a lot about this starvation situation and about a lot of these countries getting ready in September at the United Nations General Assembly meeting, where there's going to be an announcement that many countries are going to officially recognize a Palestinian state. President Trump, of course, is against that. He's threatened Canada if they go down that path, because the Canadian Prime Minister has said they are giving serious consideration to that. Keir Starmer is giving serious consideration to that. In fact, he said he would do it if there were not some changes in between now and then. And then we have the situation on the ground where we sent Witkoff to meet there yesterday. Also, the ambassador Huckabee was sent. They did some ground, and of course, they said, no, everything's fine, as you would expect, which it's not. I could do a whole show today on that. But not that they're trying to just kind of keep things on the down low on the Israeli side. They're keeping the pot stirred up. So today, we have Smotrich and Ben-Gvir saying that they urged the prime minister of destroying Gaza City. With the prime minister did not object. Apparently, the IDF chief is balking. It's not certain, not because he cares about the people in Palestine, but because he said that could cause the deaths of the remaining hostages, the Israeli hostages that are still alive in the captivity, most of which, if not all of which, the remaining ones are IDF soldiers. So the IDF chief doesn't want that to happen. But you see, it's not on moral grounds or anything else. It's on practical grounds. Well, it doesn't appear that the prime minister actually cares about his own hostages. He just cares about killing and destroying the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And so we had on our show just a couple of days ago, former IDF soldier Omer Bartov, current professor at Brown University, who says that he's a genocide studies professor at Brown. He said, "I know genocide when I see it. This is it." And he said that he has identified, and this is a very pro-Israeli person, by the way. This is a Jew. This is not somebody from the outside. This is somebody inside who is a combat veteran for the IDF. He said that he sees that there is an actual choreographed plan, a long-term plan to starve the people of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip, all the Palestinians in there, methodical and relentless to do it. Then he says the evidence is all there. We can see it with our own eyes, no matter how many times Benjamin Netanyahu will impassioned say it's not happening and we're not doing it. The evidence is unmistakable and irrevocable. You can't unsee that, what you see, and the evidence is right there if you're willing to, and there's certainly plenty that are. But now then we see they want to continue that path to destroy Gaza City. So, and Omar Batov also mentioned that there are already, he said there's not even fighting going on per se. He said most of what the IDF does right now is to bring in contractors and other people to physically destroy the infrastructure. They're doing it already, but now they want to do it openly and on a grander scale where the entire Gaza City is destroyed. You understand the implications of that. If you destroy the city outright, whatever's left, and there's not much anyway, I think there's like 30% of the structures that are not already destroyed or severely damaged. And if you do that, then you're committing the remainder of the bulk of that population. I think it's like 1 million people were, or something close to 1 million, were originally the inhabitants of Gaza City to perpetual tents. That's it. That's or living in rubble. That's all there are. No population on this planet will be satisfied and content or passive if you destroy their abilities to sustain life, reduce them to having to have food trucks come in indefinitely. We're talking years into the future. That's the best that you can get done. Or, of course, and it appears to be the intent for the Israeli side to force somebody to take them. So, because they want them out. That's the whole point. That, according to Omer Bartov, is the purpose and the intent for this operation is to compel through moral means others to finally have their heartstrings turned so much that they're willing to take them out, and the Israelis will get rid of them. This is a terrible situation and something the United States needs to have nothing to do with. And unfortunately, you see that the administration is defending a lot of this stuff. They sent their ambassador, they sent Steve Witkoff in there, and of course they're given, if not glowing reports, they're definitely not talking about how catastrophic the situation is on the ground, though other Americans are. It was an interview, a former lieutenant colonel, if I'm not mistaken, special forces guy that was interviewed on Tucker Carlson, who was on the ground in the Gaza Strip and helping with some of these humanitarian operations and was disgusted by what he saw. Very much in line with what we're talking about here on this channel, very much in contradiction to what the official narrative is there. So you can decide who you want to believe, the one who wants to support the Israeli government or the one who cares about people, because that's what we're left with there. Also in the Middle East, we also have another issue with Iran. So, of course, when the United States attacked the Iranians with their nuclear power situation here not long ago, there was a big issue of would the war be able to be sustained? Did we get rid of their nuclear weapons capacity, et cetera? But we still say that after that, well, we're still willing to have a negotiated settlement. In fact, we want to have one where they will never have nuclear weapons. Iran continues to say they're willing to talk, but now then today, the Iranian foreign minister, Arakchi, says they should explain why they, meaning the United States, attacked us in the middle of negotiations, and they have to ensure that they are not going to repeat that during future talks, Arakchi said. And they have to compensate Iran for the damage they have already done. Well, you can imagine how that's going to go over in Washington. That Iran is saying, yeah, we'll talk to you, but only after you compensate us for the attack. Now, of course, we're the big power here, so we're not going to do it. We're not going to do what they say. We certainly would never submit to doing anything Iran says, but you got to look at it from Iran's perspective and from the perspective of many other people around the world. What he's saying is not unreasonable. We were in negotiations. in negotiations with Iran at the time. There had already been several rounds of direct talks between Iran and the United States. There were additional talks that were planned for the Saturday following the time when we actually attacked, after previously saying that we were going to wait a couple of weeks before we decided what to do. We were going to have some meetings that Saturday, and then the middle of the week, we launched this attack. So we were in negotiations and we attacked them. That's the fact. That's the reality. Whether anybody likes that, whether it sounds unsavory, doesn't matter. That's what happened. And so now then, after doing that, then we're claiming that we want them to negotiate something of our preference against what they want. And they're saying, yeah, pay me for this first, because it was illegal. There was no international law that allowed it. There was no American law that allowed it. It was in total violation of the U.S. Constitution and the 1973 War Powers Act, categorical, black and white, period. There's no debate about it. Anyone who says otherwise doesn't care about the rule of law. And they will manipulate this or that, and they'll say, "Oh, well, this thing here was in play. It doesn't matter." That is nonsense, and it's just creating fiction out of thin air in violation of the clear intent of the laws. So there's that, and then there's just the humanitarian issue, just the human nature of it, that you blow up somebody and destroy a bunch of their stuff. And I'm not even sure if there was any casualties involved in this, but we definitely blew up their facilities in another country because they didn't do what we wanted to. Might makes right. That's where we're at. We used to condemn that. Now we're the personifying it. And that is an ugly situation. And folks, even if you take the morality out of it for a second, which I never do, always keep it in there, which is why I'm so passionate about this. But even if you didn't care about the morality and you just cared about your own narrow self-interest, this is stupid. It's dumb what we're doing within Russia, moving nuclear weapons around. It's dumb what we're doing supporting that war that can't be won. It's dumb what we're doing trying to compel Iran to do something here when there's no evidence. In fact, there's evidence provided that they weren't going towards a nuclear weapon, or that they hadn't made that plan for one anyway. And we didn't need to defend ourselves from it because we weren't being attacked. They were engaged in negotiations, so there was a path to a peaceful resolution of the situation. We ended that. At some point, people around the world, whether that's adversaries or neutral parties, will conclude they can't trust the United States. They're no longer the city on a hill. They're no longer the shining example of what people should aspire to. They will view us as the danger. They will view us as somebody they need to hedge against. I'm talking friends as much as adversaries. That's where we're headed. And that when people are afraid of you enough, sometimes in desperation, they will take action against you that they otherwise would never have taken. And this arrogant idea that, well, we have to be the biggest guy on the block and we have to be big and strong so that everyone will cower under us ignores human nature and ignores centuries of history where people do the opposite. You put them under your thumb long enough, you harm people long enough, and at some point, they don't care about the harm it's going to do to them. They'll do something to strike back to you. It happens all the time in history, and it doesn't need to happen here. And we just have to hope and pray that our leaders will wake up before it's too late. Because if we keep going down the path we're going here on all these issues here, we're going to end up in a war someday that we should never be in. And if you saw our show earlier today with Michael Vlahos, our military is nowhere near capable as we think it is. And if we get drawn into a war that we shouldn't have gotten into, we may lose that war. And especially if you're talking about Russia or China, those are nuclear powers, and losing a war there could mean there is an exchange of nuclear weapons and we could lose everything. Or we could, quote, only suffer a tactical nuclear strike somewhere and have our military forces decimated, aircraft carriers at the bottom of the sea, aircraft knocked out of the sky, soldiers killed on the ground for nothing. Far from ensuring our national security and making us safer and creating an opportunity to have a prosperous future, it will take it from us. By our own hands, it will take it from us. We need to learn these lessons now while there's still time. As of right now, as of today, on Saturday, August the 2nd, 2025, none of those things have happened. We're not at war against anyone. Our aircraft carriers are all still floating in the ocean. Our jets are still fully operational, and our troops are still alive. And that can continue into the distant future indefinitely, as long as we stop making suicidal, foolish decisions that potentially push others to be against us when they otherwise have no interest in doing that. We can still, even at this late hour, go back to being that shining city on a hill, to providing the example of what people should emulate and want to follow. Not be afraid of the United States, but admire the United States. This has happened in times in our past. We've got a lot of sins in our past, but there's also some good things in there where we were that shining light to others. It still isn't too late, folks. We can be that way again, but it's going to take folks like you to make your voice heard, people who want peace. I know most of the folks who watch our show do want peace. They don't want any more war. Do whatever you can to make your voice heard. Complain, whether on social media or anywhere else, against some of these foolish policies. And maybe with enough voices coming together, those folks may listen, even if they don't want to do it because it's the right thing. They may do it because it's the political thing that they're not going to get voted in the next time if they keep going down a dumb path. That's what we're going to have to hope for, because it's about all we got right now. But we'll continue to be unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, even in situations like this, where it's not pleasant for my country, the country that I fought for, and the country that I love. When we're wrong, we have to be honest about it. It's the only way we can get it fixed. Thanks very much, folks. Really appreciate you guys. Appreciate you being with us again on a Saturday. We'll see you next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.